Police made a sudden breakthrough in a murder case turned cold for nearly 30 years. Investigators say new advances in forensic technology combined with relentless police work helped to make this arrest all the way.
Deborah didn't deserve what came her way. The trauma of that event, it just kept nagging me. A cousin said that, decades after losing her. Decades of asking one question and getting the same non-answer back. Here's what makes this case different from most cold cases you'll hear about. The evidence that eventually solved it wasn't buried, wasn't missing, wasn't destroyed by time. It was sitting in an evidence locker in Michigan the entire time, collected the same night the crime happened. What was missing wasn't the proof, it was the ability to read it. That gap between what investigators had and what they could actually use is what this story is really about. Welcome to Kairo True Crime Breakdown. Picture a suburb built the way so many were after World War II. Farmland north of Detroit, cleared and paved, and filled in with brick ranch homes for families who wanted a little distance from the city without losing the convenience of it. That's Southfield, Michigan. By the 1990s, it had the settled, unremarkable feel of a place where nothing much happens, in the best possible way. One of its streets was Lee Baker Drive. Close-set houses, short driveways. The kind of block where, if you lived there long enough, you didn't just recognize your neighbors, you recognized their cars, their schedules, the sound of their garage doors at the end of a workday. Nobody wrote any of it down. It just accumulated, the way small familiarities do when you share a street with the same people for years. A sedan that pulled in around 6 every evening belonged to a specific driveway. A pickup that left before sunrise belonged to someone working an early shift across the block. None of it was conscious tracking. It was just the texture of living somewhere long enough for the ordinary to become automatic. That kind of familiarity does something specific to a neighborhood. It makes anything unusual immediately obvious. A car that doesn't belong. A face nobody recognizes. A stranger lingering too long. And it does something else too, something quieter. It makes the people who do belong almost invisible. Nobody questions what they've always seen. Deborah Kennedy lived on that street, alone, at 40 years old. Living alone in a neighborhood like this wasn't a risk in anyone's mind. It was simply how her life was arranged, surrounded by people who'd have noticed if something felt off. She worked at the General Motors Technical Center in Warren, doing engineering work for one of the biggest employers in the region, and she'd been there long enough that her co-workers knew her patterns the way you know a friend's, when she'd usually call, when she wouldn't. That predictability is part of why this story moves as quickly as it does at the start. When Deborah broke pattern, people noticed almost immediately, and that single fact ends up shaping everything that follows. On the evening of February 19, 1997, that pattern broke for good. Someone came to her front door. There was no forced entry, no broken glass, no damaged lock. She opened the door herself. What happened after that was not brief, and it was not one-sided. Deborah fought. The evidence of that fight moved through more than one room of her home, furniture disturbed, blood marking more than one wall. She was stabbed multiple times, and that's what the medical examiner recorded as cause of death. But in the middle of that struggle, she managed something that would matter enormously. Decades later, she got skin under her fingernails, torn from whoever was attacking her. And somewhere in the chaos, a credit card of hers hit the bedroom floor, carrying a fingerprint that didn't belong to her. The next morning, Deborah didn't show up for work. That alone was unusual enough to register. She was the kind of employee whose routine co-workers could set a clock by, so her absence stood out almost immediately. When phone calls to her house went unanswered, a co-worker made the decision to call Southfield police and ask for a welfare check, rather than waiting to see if she'd simply overslept or taken the day. Officers were dispatched to Lee Baker Drive. When they arrived, the first thing they noted was what wasn't there. No broken window, no forced door, nothing to suggest anyone had entered by force. That detail, small as it seemed in the moment, would end up shaping the entire direction of the investigation. Officers went inside and found Deborah dead. What they found beyond that told them this had not been quick, and it had not been quiet. Two things pulled from that scene would end up mattering more than anything else collected that day: the fingerprint on the credit card and the material recovered from beneath her nails. This channel exists for cases exactly like this, so if that's the kind of story you're here for, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's more where this came from. Here's something worth saying clearly. The detectives who worked this case in 1997 didn't fail because they were careless. They canvassed the entire block, going door to door and asking specifically about cars that didn't belong and faces nobody recognized in the hours surrounding the murder. They worked through everyone with any plausible connection to Deborah: co-workers, friends, delivery and service workers, anyone who'd had a reason to be near her door, and cleared name after name as each interview came back clean. It was thorough. It was exactly what a competent investigation should look like, run by people doing careful, methodical work with the tools they had. It also went nowhere, and the reason is almost unbearable in hindsight. Whoever left that fingerprint, whoever left that DNA, wasn't a stranger who stood out on a street built to notice strangers. His presence didn't register as unusual to anyone, because nothing about him was. Even if detectives had somehow zeroed in on him immediately, 1997 technology still couldn't have closed the case. The fingerprint was too smudged, a single faint contact, not enough ridge detail for the identification systems of the time to process. The DNA sample was real, but nowhere near large enough for the testing available in that era, which required far more genetic material than Deborah had managed to leave behind, and far cleaner conditions than a nail scraping could provide. This wasn't a failure of effort. It was a ceiling built into the science itself. Both pieces of evidence went into storage exactly as collected, and there they remained, untouched, unmatched, waiting on technology that hadn't been invented yet. Months passed, then years. Tips trickled in and dead-ended. Detectives rotated off the case as careers moved forward, each one inheriting a file that had already told them everything it could. Two lives kept moving during that silence, in opposite directions and for opposite reasons. One belonged to Deborah's cousin, Reggie Daniel, who refused to let her case become something the department simply stopped thinking about. He called year after year, and got the same response every time: nothing new. There was no dramatic confrontation in any of those calls, just the quiet, grinding persistence of someone unwilling to let a file gather dust, while the person responsible remained unnamed. What eventually changed his approach wasn't a phone call at all. It was watching other cold cases get solved through advancing DNA science, which planted the idea that Deborah's case might still have a chance. By 2023, he'd stopped calling and started showing up, asking Southfield police in person to look again. The other belonged to the man who'd left that evidence behind. Within 2 months of the murder, he was gone from Michigan entirely, resettled in Arizona, over 1,000 miles away. Eventually, he drifted back through Oak Park and Highland Park, before landing in a small Illinois town called Royal Lakes, population somewhere around 300. He worked. He drove. He lived what looked from the outside like an unremarkable life, in a place where nobody had any reason to connect him to anything that happened in Michigan decades earlier. He was arrested more than once over the years for unrelated matters, and each of those arrests entered his fingerprints, and eventually his DNA, into national law enforcement systems. That's the detail that makes what happened next so frustrating in hindsight. His profile sat inside the FBI's CODIS database for years, technically available for comparison the entire time. But a database doesn't reach backward on its own. Somebody has to make an active decision to pull an old unsolved case back off a shelf, flag it, and run it against everything the system has collected since. Nobody had flagged Deborah's case for a fresh look, so nobody had ever run it against what the system already contained. It wasn't negligence. Resubmitting evidence takes time, lab resources, and a reason to believe it might actually pay off. And for years, nobody had a reason to think this particular file would be any different than it had been in 1997. That changed in June of 2024. A Southfield detective named Brian Weeks asked his department for permission to start working cold cases, specifically chosen for their DNA potential, files where modern forensic tools might succeed, where older methods hadn't. Chief Elvin Barron approved the request and let Weeks pick which cases to pursue, prioritizing ones with a realistic shot at a match. Deborah's file turned out to be the one that mattered most. Weeks read through everything from 1997, every interview, every canvas note, every lab result that had come back empty, and reached the same conclusion the original investigators eventually would have reached themselves, given the tools. This case had never needed better detective work. It needed better science. Some of the retired detectives who'd built the original file came back to consult, curious to see what modern methods could finally do with evidence they'd carried, unresolved, for the better part of 30 years. For them, this wasn't just an old case being reopened by someone else. It was a chance to finally see whether the work they'd done decades earlier could still pay off. Weeks resubmitted the fingerprint first. By that point, enhancement software existed that could pull ridge detail out of prints older systems would have rejected outright. In January 2025, it returned a name, someone already logged in fingerprint databases because of his own unrelated arrest history, with no prior connection to Deborah Kennedy at all. He didn't stop there. The fingernail evidence went out for DNA testing, capable of working with samples far smaller and more degraded than anything usable in the 1990s. 8 months later, in September 2025, that came back too. A match to the exact same man the fingerprint had already identified. His name was Robert Joseph Covington. In 1997, he was 29, and he lived directly across the street from Deborah, sharing a home with his wife and mother-in-law, both of whom have since died. From his own driveway, he could see her front door every day, the same way she likely could have seen his. Investigators have laid out 2 possible explanations for how he ended up inside her home that night, and neither one has been confirmed. It's possible he knew her routine well enough to let himself in and wait. It's also possible Deborah trusted him enough to open the door herself. She reportedly had a friendship with his mother-in-law, after which he forced his way past her. Chief Barron has said plainly that the real motive may never surface, and this documentary won't pretend otherwise by filling that gap with speculation. What we do know is this: Covington's car belonged on that block the same way everyone else's did. Nobody flagged it. Nobody questioned it. The man Southfield police spent almost 30 years searching for had been close enough, the entire time, to watch investigators canvass his own street without a second glance in his direction. He wasn't hiding in plain sight in some dramatic, deliberate way. He simply never needed to hide at all. Sit with that for a moment. A neighborhood built entirely around noticing what didn't belong had exactly one blind spot: the people who already did. Deborah spent the final moments of her life leaving behind the one thing that would eventually name her attacker. It just took the world 29 years to build the tools capable of reading it. By March 2026, Covington was 58 and still living in Royal Lakes, unaware how close the case had gotten to catching up with him. Behind the scenes, Southfield police had spent several weeks coordinating with law enforcement in Illinois to plan exactly how and where the arrest would happen, working with the Macoupin County Sheriff's Office and the Illinois State Police to settle on a traffic stop as the safest way to take him into custody without incident. On March 29th, that plan was carried out. Deputies pulled Covington over during a routine-looking traffic stop. Body camera footage, later played publicly at a press conference, captured the moment officers approached his vehicle and told him he was being detained over a traffic warrant. According to Chief Barron, that wasn't true. It was a deliberate tactic, designed to keep the stop calm and low risk for everyone involved. rather than immediately revealing the real reason for the detention. Covington was taken into custody without further incident. It wasn't until he was brought into the station that his demeanor changed. According to Detective Weeks, Covington remained largely unbothered during the stop itself, but grew visibly uneasy once he arrived and saw detectives waiting there specifically to speak with him. A moment that seemed to signal this was about something far larger than a traffic infraction. When officers asked whether he'd ever been inside Deborah's home, he said no. When they asked how his DNA had ended up there, he stopped answering entirely. He was extradited to Michigan on April 8th and arraigned the next day in Oakland County's 46th District Court, facing charges of felony murder and open murder. Bond was denied, and he was remanded to the Oakland County Jail, with a probable cause conference scheduled for April 23rd before Judge Cynthia Arvant. According to court records available at the time of this documentary's research, no outcome from that hearing had yet been made public, and the case remained in its pre-trial stage. If a story like this keeps you watching until the end, that's exactly the kind of viewer Kairo is built for. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. On April 14th, 2026, Southfield police called a press conference to lay out everything the evidence had finally proven. Before it began, someone from the department had already reached Reggie Daniel privately, giving him the news ahead of the room. A name, an arrest, decades of silence finally broken. The man responsible turned out to be a total stranger to the family, someone none of them had ever heard of before that call, despite having lived close enough to see their front door every single day. By the time the cameras were rolling, Daniel was seated among the reporters, having already absorbed the news alone before hearing it repeated publicly. Chief Barron opened by walking through the forensic timeline, the original 1997 evidence, the 2024 decision to reopen the case, and the two matches that followed in 2025, with Detective Weeks beside him. Barron credited both the persistence behind the investigation and the forensic advances that made it possible, noting that evidence like this can still speak the truth, no matter how much time passes. Daniel spoke warmly about his cousin to reporters, describing her as someone deeply loved by her family, and said no one in the family had been able to bring themselves to set foot back in that house since the killing. Detective Weeks, clearly moved while addressing the room, called it one of the most important cases of his career, a case built, in his words, around the belief that families waiting this long deserve resolution, even when resources for cold cases are limited and hard to come by. He spoke about the families out there still waiting for a day like this one to finally arrive. After the formal statements, Daniel described what it had been like working alongside Weeks throughout the reopened investigation, calling him a bulldog, someone who simply refused to let go of a case once he'd picked it up. After nearly 30 years of hearing nothing, that kind of persistence meant everything to a family still waiting for answers, and it's part of why Daniel wanted to be in that room in person when the announcement finally came. That's really the heart of this true crime documentary story. Physical evidence doesn't expire, it waits. Sometimes for decades, sometimes for exactly one detective willing to pull an old file back out of storage and try again. The motive behind Deborah Kennedy's murder may never be confirmed, but the question her family carried for 29 years, the one Reggie Daniel refused to stop asking, year after year, call after call, finally has an answer. What comes next will play out in a Michigan courtroom, on a timeline the family will now have to wait for a different way. So here's the question worth sitting with. Was it Reggie Daniel's refusal to give up? Or was it simply science finally catching up to what Deborah left behind? Let us know what you think in the comments. We go beyond the surface, always.